I'm Allison Cruz here in Amelia County in Jetersville, and I'm for the soil.
Well, today we've got a very interesting conversation with a couple on the West Coast who are very knowledgeable about soil health. And I'll just tease it right now by saying it's a conversation with David and Anne. And you'll get to know them very well, and they are incredibly knowledgeable about soil health, and we've got a lot to learn from David and Anne. That's coming up in just a few moments, but I wanted to remind everyone of the website forthesoil.org. A lot of new information available at the website, especially on the blog. There are soil health champions, of course, an archive of all of our podcasts, the 4 core principles. We don't have to remind you. Number 1, keep soil covered. Number 2, minimize soil disturbance. Number 3, maximize living roots. And number 4, energize with diversity. You'll find all of this information at our website, forthesoil.org. That is the digit 4, thesoil.org. And now, today's podcast. Welcome, everyone, to For the Soil, a conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii, and joining us today, my 2 partners, Eric Benfelt with Virginia Cooperative Extension Community Viability, and Mary Sketch Bryant with Virginia Soil Health Coalition. We have an exciting topic today, and that is the relationship between soil health and human health. Eric, would you introduce our special guest today?
Well, thank you, Jeff. We're pleased to have David Montgomery and Anne Biklé with us. David and Anne were resource speakers several years ago at the Virginia Farm to Table Conference and spoke to people at Blue Ridge Community College and Virginia State University. And just the whole discussion about connections between soil health and human health really appealed to people. And, David is a professor of Earth and Space Sciences at the University of Washington and a geomorphologist, and he can explain exactly what that is. And Anne brings a history in biology and natural history, as well as landscape architecture, and is also worked extensively in field biology and environmental planning, as well as public health. And their most recent book is What Your Food Ate, How to Heal Our Land and Reclaim Our Health. And we just really wanted to have a conversation about that. So welcome, David and Anne, to the For the Soil podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, happy to be here.
I would start off, David and Anne, the maxim or adage is you are what you eat. I think you've really tried to address that in your book and have expounded upon that. Can you elaborate on that?
We all know that phrase, you are what you eat. And in the book, we basically try and take that one step further back to thinking about what your food ate. And you are what your food ate was just too long for a title for the book. So we shortened it to What Your Food Ate. And what we try and do in the book is to really look at the linkages between how the way we farm, the practices with which we treat the land and soil, how that influences what gets into our crops and into our livestock, and how that translates into what gets into us in our diet, particularly in the way of things that can influence the maintenance of human health, not just what it takes us to live and survive. We need calories for that, but what it takes for us to thrive, what it takes to be healthy, and how the way we treat the land ripples up through that to our own individual health, and then also to the whole health of whole societies and public health.
Yeah, I wouldn't add too much more than that, I think. Good summary there, co-author.
Well, and I would be interested, David and Anne, with For the Soil, we are obviously firm believers that everyone should care about soil health. And with what you're presenting in the book, it really pushes that even a level further, that, whether it's care for the land or care for your own human health. And just would be interested in what you're seeing among the population on making these connections and interest in soil health. Are you seeing that from a broader population?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think when you take the word soil and you put, and that's just, on its own, people might kind of scratch their head and they might not really sort of understand the importance and connection to their lives and their bodies. But as soon as you put the word health after soil, all of a sudden people, the eyes light up, and you just start talking a little bit about some of the parallels between, soil health and the health of any other organism, whether that's a plant or an animal, your goldfish, your dog, your cat, your horse, whatever it might be. People suddenly get that, oh, you mean soil can have health just like any other living thing, and that it then begins to, in a way, sort of open their eyes to all that we mean when we're talking about soil health. Just take, for example, we know with human health, just some really basic things that happen whenever you go to the doctor is, okay, well, what's your temperature? What's your blood pressure? Do a metabolic panel. This gives, the medical profession some idea of your health. And in the context of soil, one of the very biggest factors about soil health is the level of organic matter, and that's intimately tied to what kinds of life are in the soil, levels of biodiversity and so on. So I think you start talking like that, and then people begin to understand and see, oh, soil health. Yeah, that sounds like it could be pretty important.
I wanted to ask you about the title of one of your previous books. Of course, your most current book is What Your Food Ate: How to Heal Our Land and Reclaim Our Health. But one of your previous books is called Growing a Revolution: Bringing Our Soil Back to Life. And that kind of makes a presumption that the soil is not alive, because if you have to bring it back to life. So talk about the life of soil. How do we bring it back? Is it dead? How do we even measure that?
Yeah, the soil life is, you can think of it in many ways as the bacteria and the fungi that are in the soil. That's not all that's in soil life. There's worms and other things down there as well. But a lot of the really key members of the soil communities that matter to agriculture and ultimately human health are the bacteria and fungi in the soil. And some of our conventional farming practices have actually degraded that soil life, both through causing loss of the soil itself, soil erosion, but also through changing the community composition of soil life by degrading and altering the communities that are actually in the soil. And the two primary mechanisms for that are tillage and the over-reliance on things like synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, both of which alter soil communities in ways that can impact the way that things like mineral micronutrients and vitamins get into crops, or the way that crops will manufacture phytochemicals, chemicals they make for their own defense or communication purposes to maintain their own health. But that ultimately have effects in the human body when we eat those crops that are beneficial to us. So one of the things that I think is very interesting about soil life and soil health is that if we think about healthy, fertile soils as being soils, as Anne was saying, that are rich in organic matter and that have a healthy complement of species that can collaborate with crops, that can partner with crops to acquire for them things like mineral micronutrients and spur vitamin production and so on. The kind of farming practices that we would use to build soil health, to build soil organic matter, turn out to be the same kind of practices that we would use if we wanted to increase the mineral micronutrient content or the vitamin content or the phytochemical content of our food. So the way we treat the land ultimately ends up affecting what gets into our crops and our livestock and into our bodies that can help us maintain health or not, depending on how we actually farm.
And then Anne and David, I think in your study, you also talk about like the role of soil health and nutrient density. I think you started looking at nutrients and vitamins, but then as you spoke, David, that also the importance of soil life, the phytochemicals, essential fatty acids. And then I'm always reminded of a previous guest, Chris Lawrence. I think we all know that he makes the comment that you need to mulch your soil, you need to mulch your your gut. And, that speaks to really keeping that biology moving. But I'd like to hear how you went about looking at nutrient density.
Anne, you want this one, or do you want me to do it?
Go for it. I'll pipe
Okay.
up.
We looked at the effect of farming practices on nutrient density in a couple ways. One, we looked back at the scientific literature and just read everything we could find that was possibly related to the subject. And we've divided the book into thinking about, the connections of farming practices on soil health, then the effects of soil health on crop health, effect of farming practices on livestock health, and then how that all rolls up into human health. And one of the questions that we were left with is that there aren't a lot of studies that have used soil health as sort of the metric to gauge things against. So we conducted a little pilot study of looking at 10 paired farms around the US, regenerative farms and a neighboring conventional farm, where we looked at both the soil health on those farms, and we tested a limited amount of the crops coming off those farms, where they grew the same crop in the same climate and the same soil type, but they've been treated differently for at least 5 to 10 years, and looked at what we saw as differences. And the bottom line is that we saw consistently that the regenerative farms had higher levels of soil organic matter, about twice as much soil organic matter on average in the topsoil. So we're just looking at the topsoil. And then also they had a 3 times the soil health score with the Haney soil health score. So there's more and abundant and diverse life that was more active and more organic matter in the regenerative fields. And then on the crop end of things, we saw that there was, there's a fair amount of variability, as you might expect. But on average, the regenerative crops had something like, I think about 20% or around there on average, high levels of phytochemicals. And in terms of vitamins, it depended on which vitamin. I think there's 34% more vitamin K and more like 14 or 15% more vitamin C and E, if I'm recalling right. But in other words, we saw some evidence that the crops grown in healthier, fertile soils had higher abundances or higher nutrient density, more of the micronutrients that help to benefit human health.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the interesting things when you talk about nutrient density, that whole concept is that we're getting plant and animal foods that have both an abundance of whatever particular thing that plant or animal food might be known for, but you're also getting those things in the right proportion. And so just take, for example, the fat balance in animal foods. What you really want is, a balance of omega-6 and omega-3 fats. You don't want, a whole lot of one and hardly any of the other. So nutrient density has this sort of dual definition in terms of you're looking for proportionality, you're looking for good levels of things, and you're also looking for foods that, remember, we don't want toxins in our food. So I always like to bring this up when we talk about nutrient density. There's what you do want in there in the right proportions, and there's what you don't want in there because that's just not going to do us any good. So I think one of the things about the small study that we did not find in the research that we did in other reviewing all of these other papers is that it's really important to look at soil health on 2 adjacent farms that are both growing the same crop. Too often study designs are just taking a crop from here and a crop from some other farm and saying, well, let's look at what these differences are. But they haven't really also at the same time done some kind of an assessment of soil health. And so that we were able to do soil health, neighboring farm, and same crop. And we like to, also point out that this was not a big study and that we, have learned everything that there is to learn about this. This is just like, maybe one tiny layer of that proverbial onion that we started to peel back.
Well, David and Anne would be interested, it's obviously very complex and nuanced and, but for your average consumer who's reading this and then trying to think, okay, how should this and could this impact my decisions? What would you suggest?
Well, I'd suggest the healthiest diet would essentially be one that is rich in fresh whole foods grown or raised on healthy, fertile soils. How you know make sure you're getting that can be a little more challenging that I'll let Ann answer.
Pitching me the hardball. Okay, here's I think it's really important, and I know in your guys' neck of the woods there's a lot of farmers and there's farmer markets, and anytime you can get a direct line to a producer, whether that is for crops or your animal foods, starting up a conversation or sending an email, or if you're at a farmer's market, just asking, what can you tell me about your production practices? And, if you have a farmer, I think this would be pretty unusual, especially at a farmer's market, but if you have a farmer looking back at you with kind of a blank look, you probably want to move on from from there and go put that same question to another farmer. And most producers are more than happy to talk about their farm and their practices. I know that whenever I get into a conversation with a farmer, here at my favorite farmers market in Seattle, I feel like I'm there with them on the farm. And of course, I'm a person who asks a lot of questions, and they never hold back. And because they really know, anytime you're working with the land or you're working with animals, it's just chock full of experiences and observations and all of that. So I think asking questions, and if there's certification programs that are robust and reliable, that you also think about that. So
I'm going to leave the final question to Eric Benfeld, but my final question is, and your conversation prompted this, is about food labeling. In our lifetime, we have seen a massive change in how foods are labeled. What is the one thing that consumers should look for on a food label to know that they're eating something healthy?
Wow, that's just one thing. Here's what I wish we could look at on a food label, and that is if there was some sort of measure or score for nutrient density, what we've been talking about, the kinds of compounds, nutrients, molecules, because it's not just carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, but if we just had nutrient density and we had some kind of a score or something like that, so that a consumer could know, oh, okay, one number, one thing here for me to look at, as opposed to nutrition labels. I'm not against nutrition labels. I just think they're such a small slice of the story. If we had nutritional density, maybe a soil health score there, what I would really like to see is something about the biotic integrity of the farm or the ranch where our foods came from. So if we could roll something up into one thing, Jeff, I'd really be in favor of that.
I like that idea of a simplistic numerical. Say, for instance, cinnamon rolls are number 1, but spinach is number 10. I get that. 1 is low, 10 is high, but anyway, okay. Enough about that. Eric, we got a couple of minutes remaining here. Your last question.
Sure. Well, David and Ann, I think one of the questions you raise is your research. What does it mean to be a farmer or eater in pursuit of health? And I think particularly taking control of, care of the land and as well as care of our bodies. And I think particularly in relationship to these ideas of paired comparisons and being able to do your own research.
Yeah. As I just was mentioning before, it would be really nice if for every region of the country, Southeast, Northwest, Midwest, if we could do more comparisons of different practices on side-by-side farms, we would be learning more about what works in each of these regions that is good for soil health and that translates into the kind of nutrient density that we want. I think that would be, super, super helpful. So I think at this point, at least in North America, we have successfully figured out how to feed people, but in that process, we kind of lost sight of how to nourish people. And I think, if there's one simple message from the book, it's this, that, if it's good for the land and it's nourishing for the land, chances are the same is going to be true for the people who are eating food, produced on that kind of a farm that's treating land and soil well.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. The name of your most recent book, What Your Food Ate, How to Heal Our Land and Reclaim Our Health. Thank you, David and Anne, for joining us today.
Thank you. No worries.
Yeah, you bet.
Yes, thank you so much.
That is all the time we have for today's episode. I hope you'll join us for part 2 of our conversation with David Montgomery and Anne Biklé. For the Soil, a conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. If you have a specific question about soil health, contact your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a soil and water conservation district office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts, all rights reserved. For the Soil, a conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii.